Hello, my name is Brant Hunt. Today is the 17th day of February 2013. I'm sorry, 2023, and I'm going to be reading the last chapter of Americans Engineered Decline, The Wages of Perpetual War. The author's name is William Norman Grigg, Grigg. So this is a book that has some good information in it. It tells you that basically our country has been destroyed from within. And it's happening all around us, folks. Everything around us. For example, um, you know, there's less and less competition out there. There are less and less what I would call, what I'm just going to refer to as Albertsons and Kroger. They're thinking about actually merging. Actually, that was late last year. I don't know if it's gone through or not, but I think it's supposed to take place possibly this year. I'm not in favor of that. There are a couple of, there is a German grocery store here. Food Line is owned by a Dutch company. So there's those companies you recognize. You think, okay, um, which is Aldi's. Aldi's is the German operation, and then you have what I call, what's the word I want to say? The other grocery store is Food Line. Is actually owned by a Dutch group. Been bought out, I think, approximately 8 to 10 years ago. So there isn't many American-owned grocery stores anymore either. So it's kind of interesting. But let's get into the book here, and let's the wages of war. Of all the enemies to public liberty, war is perhaps the most to be dreaded because it comprises and develops the germ of every other. War is the parent of armies. From these proceeds debts and taxes, and armies and debts and taxes are the known instruments for bringing the many under dominion of the few. No nation could preserve its freedom in the midst of continual warfare. James Madison, 1795. Another quote. We are not going to achieve a new world order without paying for it in blood as well as in words and money. Historian Arthur Schlesinger Jr. Another quote. We shouldn't have had been there in the first place. We have people in America who don't have health care benefits, and they're sending health care benefits to Iraqis. America's in the role of global policeman, and we're going to fill that role until it destroys us. Justin Madrigas is Madereiras, teenage son of the Army reservist deployed to Iraq on peacekeeping duties. Another quote. We've got the best recruiting force in the world. We've got a soft economy, and we've got opportunities that resonate with young Americans. Colonel Thomas Nicholson, Director of Strategic Outreach for the U.S. Army Assassination Command. So let's get in the book. War is the unfortunate reality of human condition, one that will plague us for the foreseeable future. For those whose views are shaped by Western, that is, the just war tradition, there are only a handful of cases in which war is justified. In fact, where war is permissible, is essentially mandatory. No moral man can refuse to fight when necessity to protect the innocent and defend freedom. The armed forces of the United States have a noble and honorable quote unquote legacy. Don't know if I exactly agree with that. They also have a distinction of being the first fighting force in human history created for the exclusive purpose of upholding the principles of Republican liberty enshrined in a written constitution. Our independence and liberty depend to a large extent on the willingness of Americans to enlist for service under our nation's flag. The American founding fathers, who had wrestled their independence from Great Britain by a trial of arms, understood the necessity of providing for a strong defense. They also understood and moved to preempt the dangers posed by standard military establishments, which historically have been perverted into instruments of tyranny. The founders understood that where war is necessary to protect our liberties and independence, it must be fought, won, and ended. As Madison warned, neither liberty nor prosperity can survive a state of perpetual war. Okay. Gateway to perpetual war. In the wake of 9/11, most Americans understood that a military response of some type against some foreign enemy was inevitable. Of course, more than a few wonder why in light of the hundreds of billions of dollars spent every year on defense, our federal government was unable to prevent the legal terrorist strike against our most prominent cities by 19 quote unquote knife wielding fanatics. But most of those critics understood that an act of war had been committed against our country, one that demanded a military reply, assuming, of course, that the enemy could be identified. President George W. Bush quickly identified the notorious terrorist chieftain, quote unquote, Osama bin Laden, who at the time was residing in Afghanistan. As the mastermind of the Black Tuesday atrocity, had President Bush asked for a declaration of war against Afghanistan, he almost certainly would have received one from Congress. But Congress chose instead to issue an open-ended resolution approving the use of force against any nation or foreign power the president adjures to be in league with terrorists. This resolution, along with various UN Security Council resolutions, was used to justify the invasion and occupation of Afghanistan. A similar formula was followed when, in March 2003, the Bush administration invaded and occupied Iraq. Again, the president invoked various UN Security Council resolutions, and congressional resolutions supposedly authorized the president to enforce them. Got a problem with that, folks. Why does the United States have to be always asking the UN for, quote unquote, for support or being allowed to do this? It tells you one thing. It tells you in a big red flag that the United States no longer is a free country. It's already put itself under bondage of the United Nations. That's what it says. Very few people realize that. And this has been going on since the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and whatever else wars we've been involved in. And we've been involved in a lot of them, folks, even after World War II. So it bothers me when I hear people, okay, you got permission from who? The Constitution is the supreme law of our land. If we're going to do this, and we're going to be a country, let's do it. You see, if not, let's stop playing games. You see, the Bush administration insisted that Iraq posed an immediate threat to our nation. But within days, folks, they decided this was who this guy was that chose. How did they know that? They didn't. And also, how in the world did all this happen? We know that the planes did not take down the towers. There's no way. There's no way at all that took place. That took place with controlled demolition. Simple as that. The Bush administration insisted Iraq posed an immediate threat to our nation, but they hadn't sent their Navy here. They hadn't sent any Air Force here. They didn't attack us that way. You see, it was a self-inflicting wound, folks. That's how that would happen. By the end of 2003, it was clear that it never did. A conclusion confirmed beyond dispute by the congressional testimony of Chief U.S. Arms Inspector David Kay in early 2004. Shortly before the war began, a national opinion poll revealed that a majority of the American public believed that Saddam Hussein had been involved in the 9/11 attacks. But by late 2003, however, administration officials from the president on down admitted that it had no evidence of a Iraq role in 9/11 or of significant ties with al-Qaeda terrorist networks blamed for the atrocity. Immediately before the war began, the administration abruptly changed the party line again. Now the war was to serve the humane purpose of liberating Iraqis from the grip of the despot Saddam Hussein. You need to read John Coleman's book, folks. It was all a rouge. It was all to do for support of, oil, you see. A tyrant whose regime had profited as a client of both Washington and Moscow. Practicing on the eve of the war, President Bush made a public address in which he described the impending conflict as the opening phase of the regional democratic revolution in the Middle East. Oh, now we're going to set him free here. A concept that he eventually expanded into global democratic revolution, you see. In November 2003 speech in London, Whitehall Palace, that is, Mr. Bush insisted that we now have only two options, that is, to deal with Iraq, to keep our word or to break our word. Wow, so many people died for that over nothing. The failure of democracy in Iraq would throw his people back into misery and turn that country over to terrorists who wished to destroy us. Yet democracy will succeed in Iraq because our will is firm, our word is good, and the Iraqi people will not surrender their freedom. Keeping our word, he explained, would also mean that paying additional billions of dollars in foreign aid, intervening, intervening elsewhere in order to promote the global democratic revolution, and working to bolster the credibility of the United Nations as an effective instrument of our collective security. The credibility of the UN depends on our willingness to keep its word and to act when action is required. Wait a minute. Whoa, 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 whoa. Wait. We're not the United Nations, are we? Huh? We're the United Nations, and we're the United States, aren't we? You see what's going on here? We've been all asleep, folks. Indeed, admitted Mr. Bush, the chief purpose of the war in Iraq is to prevent the United Nations from suddenly choosing its own irrelevance and inviting the fate of the League of Nations. This was the central point of the president's address, which was captured in the headline chosen for the London Guardian story about the speech. Iraq war saved the UN, says President. I won't go there. Anyway, continue. War for the core, C-O-R-E. The Iraqi war left the United States with roughly half of our military entrenched in the Middle East, according to Thomas P. M. Barnett, Pentagon futurist and a key advisor to Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld. Entangling our military in the region is actually the most important achievement of the war. Really? Not really. When the United States finally goes to war again in the Persian Gulf, wrote Barnett shortly before the war began, it will not constitute a setting of old scores or just to enforce disarmament of illegal weapons or a distraction in the war on terror. Our next war in the Gulf will mark a historical tipping point, the moment when Washington takes real ownership of strategic security in the age of globalization. This is why the public debate about the war had been so important. It forced Americans to come to terms with the new security paradigm that shapes the age, namely disconnectionism. That is, disconnectionism defines danger. Saddam Hussein's outlaw regime is dangerous, disconnected from the globalist world, from its rule sets, its norms, and all the ties that bind countries together in mutual assurance dependence. So he was seen as somewhat of a threat, and we've got to do something about him. So we're going to go over there and use our soldiers, our money, and destroy him. In the aftermath of 9/11, Barnett, a professor of warfare analysis at the U.S. Naval War College, repeatedly offered a standard briefing to high-level military officials and policymakers at the Pentagon. The briefing focused on a division of the world between the functioning core, nations that have been assimilated into the global system of collective security. Here comes that word again, collective security, and managed trade and the non-integrating gap, nations yet to be assimilated. A small number of nations were designated seam states along the border between the core and the gap. So this is what he's saying is why we went over there. You need to get your act together and you're going to be a part of us no matter what. The operative security principle in the golden age, global age, I should say, pontificated by Barnett, is a country's potential to warrant a U.S. military response is inversely related to its globalization connectivity. See, these are all UN words here, folks. This has nothing to do with them even the attack. Nothing. It was an excuse to go in. So as it was in Afghanistan too. If we step back for a minute and consider the broader implications of this new global map, the United National Security Strategy would seem to be increase the core immune system capabilities for responding to September 11 type turbulence. 2, work the seam states to firewall the core from the gap's worst exports, such as terror, drugs, and pandemics, and most importantly. And in 3 is to shrink the gap. Where does the war of Iraq fit into this picture? Barnett offered a revealing answer. The real reason I support a war like this is that the resulting long-term military commitment will finally force America to deal with the entire gap as a strategic threat environment. The gap, it should be explained, is everything outside of North America, much of South America, the European Union, Putin's Russia, Japan, and Asia emerging economies, most notably China and India, Australia and New Zealand and South Africa. Taken together, gap and seam states account for roughly 2 billion people, including hundreds of millions of unemployed or underemployed third world young men, potential recruits for terrorists or guerrilla movements. Here's my point. He doesn't share this, but I'm going to share my point. We created these. Guerrillas and terrorist folks. We created these groups in order for us to show we are the ones. This country plus other countries, particularly the West, but yes, definitely the United States. We create these enemies. Is what we do in order to use it as a way for people to be galvanized to fight some enemy, which is actually a control enemy, you see. And that's where this whole idea simply is going on. There are no enemies, folks. These are paid, what I would call provocateurs or paid mercenaries, whatever you want to call it. So I don't always agree with things because I see things differently than other people. So what's happened simply is we have paid for these terrorists, you see. We've done this. That's my theory. Citing an example of Communist China, a nation designated as a member of the core despite being ruled by a Communist party whose ideology formula is 30% Marxist-Lenin and 70% Sopranos. Barnett explains that the WTO membership forces each member state to harmonize its internal rules set with that of globalization. So we got it. This guy Barnett is big time globalist. Banking, tariffs, copyright protection, environmental standards, trying to adapt to globalization does not mean that bad things will never happen to you, nor does it mean all your poor will immediately morph into stable middle class. It is always possible to fall off this bandwagon called globalization. And when you do, bloodshed will follow. If you're lucky, so will American troops. So what this is simply is part of it is to deal with countries that basically maybe road nations. Meaning that it's a way to reinforce to everybody else that if you get out of line, the big bad wolf is kind of going to get you. The United States uses this all as materials because it's economically supposedly strong, nowhere near what it used to be. Our military is what we call whipping boys because we go always now, we fight other countries for all kinds of reasons, folks. It's not always to do with, a lot of it could be doing with what I would call in Afghanistan to do with drugs, just like it was in Vietnam. You know, and we were there how many years? There were men that came back and said that basically they would stay there, protected what we call poppy fields. You see. Most Americans would object to the notion that America's military is intended to be a global constatable force rather than to defend our homeland and its citizens. But as Barnett appropriately observes, since the supposed end of the Cold War, the U.S. military has been used exclusively as a global comp. That's correct. Definitely correct. Between 1990 and 2002, that's 12 years, the U.S. military was dispatched on 132 separate foreign deployments, wars, major air commands, occupations, and so on, all of which involve countries having trouble with globalization. The disconnected countries are where you find instability. That's where you find threats to the international system and the global economy. You see, these are countries that are not going along with what we want them to do, or they've got the wrong kind of leader and they need to get rid of them, or something of that nature. You see, it's not there to promote freedom. It's quite the opposite. Rather than protecting our nation is constituted from all enemies, foreign and domestic, under the emerging global position of U.S. military's job is forceful to assimilate nations to the central managed global economy. Rather than fighting and dying on behalf of home and heart, American servicemen are now expected to kill and die on behalf of the UN, the WTO, and other instruments of global connectivity. And American civilians are expected to sacrifice on behalf of the connectivity as well. In an increasingly small world, we will be living with violence and terror unless we open up the world's bad neighborhoods to economic opportunity. We have to fight those who would hijack societies and disconnect them from the global economy. We have to accept some immigrants from aspiring countries, but more importantly, we need to accept their imports and help them get on a sensible development path, which will never happen, folks. It's a continuous war. And all quite simple, according to Barnett. Our tax dollars, industrial capacity, and servicemen will be sent abroad in the interest of building the global economy. Developing nations will send us wave after wave of low price imports as well as their unemployed immigrants. As historian Arthur Schlesinger Jr. observed nearly a decade ago, we're not going to achieve a new world order without paying for it in blood as well as in words and money. The toll inflicted on our nation by the war in Iraq is merely a down payment on the price of building the connected world envisioned by the power elite and described in such clinical fashion by Barnett. To those with whose sons, daughters, fathers, and mothers return from Iraq in shipping tubes, that price is much too high. Demolishing Saddam's ruling infrastructure was relatively easy. Restoring some semblance of order afterwards proved to be a much larger challenge. Scores of Americans died in the initial invasion. Hundreds more were killed by guerrilla attacks after May 1st, 2003, the day that President George W. Bush claimed that major military operations in Iraq were over. Thousands of others were wounded, many of them left incapacitated by combat wounds or illnesses. By the end of November 2003, the total number of American casualties in Iraq, killed in action, wounded, and injured, or gravely ill, had reached approximately 9,675, the numerical equivalent of nearly a full Army division. I don't think even that is the whole story, though, condensed Nancy Lessin, Lessin, of Boston, whose son fought in Iraq. We think there's an effort to hide the true costs of life, limb, and the mental health of our soldiers. There's a larger picture here of really trying to hide and obfuscate what's going on, and the wounded and injured are part of it. Not included in that grim complication are the home front casualties, such as families left in grim economic circumstances as their breadwinners are deployed abroad. Those who bear the burden, as a young man named Mike Gorski of Hayward, California, served 4 years in the United States Marines. After mustering out of the Corps, Gorski enlisted in the National Guard 1 weekend of training a month, 2 weeks on active duty. He then married, started a family, and began a career as a banker. Gorski and tens of thousands of other guardsmen and Army reservists were called to active duty following the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001. And like hundreds of thousands of Americans in uniform, Gorski was deployed in Iraq after the March 2003 invasion of that country, which was sold to the public as necessary to preempt a possible Iraq terrorist strike on our homeland. Mike Gorski's unit, the 870 Military Police Company of the California National Guard, included teachers, bankers, mortgage brokers, telecommunication experts, police officers, and copy machine repairmen, reported the New York Times. There's a father who has not seen his first child, one who has not seen his second, and a grandfather who's raising his grandson. These part-time soldiers were told that their tour would last 6 months. As the morass deepened in Iraq, their deployment was eventually expanded to a full year, a development that prompted widespread protests from Guard and Reserve families. You can't rely on these occupations to be done by the Guard and Reserves, observed Florida Senator Bill Nelson. They have a specialized niche, and in times of war, that's one thing. But in times of long, lengthy occupation, you can't take them away from their employers and their families. The employers of Guardsmen and Reservists are required by law to hold their jobs for them while the servicemen are deployed abroad. However, they are not required and should not be expected to keep paying salaries to their absent employees. Fortunately for Gorski's family, his patriotic employer continued to pay his salary, permitting his wife to make mortgage payments and to assume a volunteer role leading a support group for other families of the 870. Within a few months, Mrs. Gorski had run up an $11,000 credit card bill from phone calls, postal costs, care packages, and paying for family support meetings and dinners. But many of the family Mrs. Gorski tended to were in much worse financial condition. Specialist Jory Preston, a telecommunication worker from Pleasant Hill, California, enlisted with the National Guard in January 2003 as a way to make ends meet. He and his wife married in February. A month later, his wife expecting their first child, Jory was en route to Iraq. Preston's employer chose to stop paying his salary. As a result, his family, his wife and newborn child, lost $2,000 a month. After giving birth, Jory's wife, Anita, was forced to move out of the couple's apartment and move in with her father. She also succumbed to clinical depression. They told us when we first got deployed it would be 6 months, the whole thing, stated Preston. I thought I could handle that. And I wasn't aware of my wife's situation. I thought I could suck it up and drive on, as the soldiers say. Right now, it's the small things that play on the minds of the family left behind, stated Janine McIver, who organized a support group called A Family of One for spouses and children of the reservists deployed to Iraq. Apart from oblivious concerns over mortgage payments, medical bills, and other large expenses, families suddenly deprived of up to half of their expected household income must deal with smaller expenses that are usually taken for granted. What about Thanksgiving, that is turkey? How can we afford school supplies? Compounding the financial hardship suffered by families of guardsmen was what Congressman Christopher Shays called a virtual systematic meltdown of the military pay system. Incredible, 94% of the mobilized National Guardsmen experienced problems receiving their pay. According to a guardsman who served as a paymaster for a unit in Afghanistan, every soldier in his company has some form of pay problem. One waited 6 weeks to get his first check. Another had his wages improperly garnished for 4 months. Another spent each week making cost-prohibitive satellite telephone calls home trying to determine if he'd been paid correctly and making sure his family had enough money to pay the bills. This is your great government, folks. Those left behind, the emotional toll of prolonged deployment, although impossible to tabulate objectively, just as formal as the financial burden. Do these women miss their men? Believe me, they face their emotional change from the day he packs his bag and leaves. Sir Jenny McIver, who was born and raised in a military family. Can they stay faithful for a whole year? I'm not even going there, but I'll tell you that there is going to be a big problem when the men do get home. Lengthy deployments abroad can result in other domestic complications. When Army Reservist Jamie Peters was deployed to Iraq on February 2003, his daughter Ladia was 5 months old. For months afterwards, she would smile and exclaim, "Dada," whenever she saw a picture of her father. By the time she was a year old, however, her typical reaction had changed. She would throw the picture down and cry, "No." She hadn't seen her dad. Guardsman Eric Kringslow of Brookings, South Dakota, was in Iraq when his son Toby was born. And his wife not being 7 months pregnant, she would have been sent to Iraq as well when her guard unit was called up. The Kingslows were hardly the only two soldier family affected by the war. Sergeant First Class Vaughn and Specialist Simone Harcombe of Colorado Springs were both called up for service in Iraq, leaving behind 7 children in the care of the Vaughn's mother and ex-wife. Wow. Simone has served in the National Guard before joining the Army. In an ideal world, I wanted to be a soldier and a mom, she recalled. It's also safe to assume that raising a family of 7 children requires more income than Vaughn could provide alone. However, after the couple was called to serve their country abroad, Vaughn's ex-wife filed for custody of the 3 daughters they had prior to the divorce. After Vaughn and Simone were granted an emergency leave to contest the claim, a judge ruled that one of them must remain behind to care for the children. It was decided that Vaughn would return to his tank platoon, and Simone, defying orders to return to Iraq, chose to remain behind. She was given administration punishment and threatened with criminal charges for going AWOL. Eventually, Simone was taken off active duty and quietly returned to guard without further punishment. Wow, this is unbelievable, folks. As the Iraq conflict deepened, commentator Bill Kaufman describes the increasing common spectacle of women, reservists, young mothers of infants, and small children leaving their families to go halfway around the world as act as cogs, expendable parts in the machinery of the empire. One of them was Lori Pistawad, a Hopi woman from Arizona and mother of 2 small children, killed in an attack that wounded Jessica Lynch. Widespread disruption of family life is an inevitable byproduct of long-term foreign conflicts, notes Kaufman. The Second World War, by removing men from households and removing many of those households from the rural South into an unwelcoming urban North, waged its own mini war upon the American family. Rosy derivative propaganda aside, the domestic face of the warfare state was sketched by an Arkansas social worker. Children's fathers go off to war and their mothers go to work. Thus, the interest of parents is diverted from the home and the children. One significant difference between World War II and the open-ended war on terrorism is that too frequently both the father and mother are sent off to war. Not surprisingly, all of these problems have led to collapsing morale and severe attrition in terms of recruitment and retention of guardsmen and reservists. Retention is what I am most worried about, admitted Lieutenant General James Hemley, head of the Army Reserves. This is the first extended duration of war this country has fought with an all-volunteer force. Although historically the Guard and Reserve were designed to be deployed rapidly and then brought home immediately, they have now entered what Lieutenant General Hemley calls a brave new world of lengthy, dangerous deployments abroad. This could result in reserves being deployed for 15 months or more as a stretch. The National Guard was originally intended to serve as each state selected militia. That's correct. In the post-September 11th environment, however, both the regular Army and the National Guard are being transformed into a national building force, rather for rapid deployment anywhere in the world on short notice, and foreign deployments of a year or more will likely become the norm. This assumes, of course, that the Guard and Reserves will be able to attract and keep skilled personnel. People are dropping out left and right, commented an officer in the Army Reserve from Milwaukee National Guard Associates, spokesman John Goheen, admitted that there is some concern over current operation tempo. How much is too much? How much will it impact recruiting? Next chapter of the next paragraph is simply perpetual war versus prosperity. As James Madison warned, liberty and prosperity cannot long endure. In the midst of continual warfare, war is the single greatest stimulant to government's growth. It devours wealth, it destroys capital, it sows lasting intimates, and deprives society of its bravest and most capable men. It is occasionally a necessary evil, but it is no less evil when it proves to be necessity. Even when fought for the right reason, war is a plague. When inflicted on population for wrong reason, it is a singular crime. In order to create the centrally designed, directed global economy described Barnett, our nation must assume the sorrowful burdens of empire until deprived of our liberties, stripped of our prosperity, and bloodied by endless foreign conflicts. Our depleted nation surrenders its independence to the global government our rulers are assembling even now. And that is the end. So I thought I'd share that with you. It's an interesting book. Again, sadly, let me look into this real quick here. Let's look at how, I'm trying to remember, William Norman Grigg. He passed away April 12, 2017. He was born in February 4th, 1963. He written quite a few books. He was born in Burley, Idaho, graduate from Utah State University, majoring in political science. He served the Provo Daily Herald, Communist, and Washington Journals before seeing the light and started working in 1993 as a correspondent, researcher, and senior director for the New American, the oldest biweekly magazine of the John Birch Society. Based at JPS offices in Appleton, Wisconsin, Grigg covered United Nations summits and conferences from 1994 to 2001 and wrote The Freedom on the Author, 1995, a study of the UN family policy. Maybe we'll read that book. I don't always agree with the John Birch Society. I do believe they were correct, and basically we didn't need the United Nations. It has no business in our country. That was one of the reasons why I was involved in it one time. I know he wrote another book. I'll have to see if I can find that. Grigg is also a Hawaiian / Cherokee, Irish descent Basque. So he's been involved. He's got different blood in him. He died of a heart attack on April 12, 2017. He wrote the Gospel of Revolt because of feminism versus the family. He wrote The Freedom on the Altar, the UN Crusade Against God and Family. He wrote Global Gun Grab, 2001. He wrote this particular book I'm reading now, which is America's Engineered Decline, 2004. And he wrote a book here called Liberty in and it eclipsed the rise of the Homeland Security State in December of 2007. I thought he wrote another book on the what I would call the protecting our border, the homeland type of deal, but I don't see it here. So, but I did. So it's been 5 years ago, over 5 years ago. So thank you for being here. I don't want to mean to drag this thing on, but anyway, appreciate you being here. The Wages of Perpetual War in the book, America's Engineered Decline. I do recall, actually, I want to say something. I remember basically back in the 80s that they already talked back then. It was called the Rapid Deployment Forces. And this is what it was. They were already talking about that in the early 80s. And I bought the book and somehow misplaced it. I don't know where it's at. But it was about what just took place in Iraq back in 2003. They were going to send forces from all over different parts of the world, that is not just here in the United States, but other places. And there were going to be a rapid force to actually to bring material, weapons, whatever, and be able to do that in that type of deal. So anyway, this is an enormously interesting book. If you get a chance, it's not that costly. When I bought this book, it was $6. So maybe it's hopefully that same price. But I appreciate you being here. Thank you for listening. I wish you a good night. You take care.